Thank you all. We will be starting with our next speakers who are going to be here in the room with us. We have Linda Bedwell, who is the Coordinator of Assessment at Dalhousie University Libraries, and also Lachlan McLeod, who is the Copyright Services Coordinator at the Dal Libraries. And they're going to speak about, well, their title of their presentation is Measuring Expectations Among Underrepresented Student Groups. We have the captioning still live. And then also online, I will be monitoring the chat, but without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Linda and Lachlan.
Okay, hi, and hi to everybody online. Lachlan and I are going to share with you some results specific to underrepresented student groups from a recent survey that we did at Dal Libraries. Now, it's really interesting data, but we don't have a whole lot of time, so we're only going to give some partial results to share with you today. And then I'm going to quickly give a quick background on how we gathered this data. Lachlan's going to give a quick background on how we analyze this data. And so because we're having to cover that stuff off pretty quickly, by all means, get in touch with us directly if you have any questions and want more information. And obviously, we have some question time at the end as well. Okay, so first off, how did we gather this data? So as the coordinator of assessment at Dal Libraries, I'm periodically responsible for conducting a total market pre-packaged library service quality survey. And so I think a few people are like, what is that? You probably have all heard of LibQual. Okay, so that's basically what I'm talking about. So we were about to run this type of survey last year, and I thought, maybe there's a chance here to add on a demographic question. And that way we could gather some more information on the perspectives of certain groups of students that are kind of typically underrepresented when you do surveys like this. So this was basically an opportunistic approach, adding on an extra demographic question. And so in the library assessment field, we call that guerrilla style assessment. And so you think quick, opportunistic, easy, and yet still very effective. So we didn't actually do LibQual last year. Instead, we went with a different survey that's been conducted by post-secondary libraries in Australia for several years, and that's by a firm called InSync. So this is just a quick rundown of what the InSync survey includes. So you have 27 core questions, and those are where the respondent gives a rating on a scale of 1 to 7, and I'm going to show you a quick example in just a second. It includes 5 multiple choice questions, a comment box, and of course there are demographic questions included. And so because you have those demographic questions, you're able to look at the results by certain groups of respondents. So for example, you may want to know how faculty responded to certain questions, how science students responded, for example, undergrads, grads, maybe first year arts and social science students. So those demographic questions allow you to do that. So here's the example that I wanted to show you. This is just one of those 27 core questions. But as you can see, you have a statement and then you have 2 scales, one for importance and one for performance. Now, during this presentation, we are only going to be focusing on the importance scale. So the respondent would then, actually, sorry, I'm skipping over a little bit. When you get the data back, what you can do is you can focus on the data in several different ways. You can look at how folks scored things in terms of how important they felt those aspects of library services are. You could see your performance, so things that they said you were pretty good at, things that were a little bit lower down on the scale. And you can also look at the difference between those scores, so the difference between the importance score and the performance score, so that can give you a gap. So I'll give you an example with this one in particular. So this statement is concerning library workshops, classes, and tutorials. And so if I was a student responding to this question, maybe I might think that this stuff is really, really important. So I may rate it a 7. When it comes to performance, though, say I didn't have a whole lot of good experiences with in-class instruction, so maybe I would have given it a score of 4. So that creates a 3-point gap. And so that would tell us, if that was the average score that a certain group of, say, students gave to this question, we would know that we have a 3-point gap that we have room to improve on when it comes to library workshops, classes, and tutorials. So usually these prepackaged surveys, and so when I say prepackaged, what I mean is you don't get to write your own questions. Usually they don't allow any customization whatsoever in those surveys. And that's because you have consortiums of libraries who are doing the survey at the same time, and they need to be able to benchmark or maybe compare against their scores in the past. So those questions have to remain very consistent over time. So usually you can't do any customization. Now, InSync were a little bit flexible with us, and that's because we were only the second Canadian institution to use this survey. So when I had to feel that they were being pretty flexible, I began to ask, well, is there a chance we can add a demographic question? So I saw it as an opportunity for us to learn about our underrepresented student groups, their perspectives on library services, distinct from kind of like the typically represented student population. So InSync did say yes. And then we basically had nothing to go on because as far as I knew, no one else had been able to do this before with these prepackaged surveys. So we didn't have a list of underrepresented groups that we could kind of copy and use. So we were building this list from scratch. So what we did is the survey team, we met and we discussed, and then I consulted with Dal's senior education developer for diversity and inclusivity. And eventually this is what we ended up with. So this is the question exactly as it appeared in the survey. So we came up with this list: Black student, distance student, first generation student, Indigenous student, international student, LGBTQ2SIA+ student, student with a disability, student from a minority group not mentioned above, and then they had options prefer not to say or none of the above. Now, all of the InSync questions in the survey, they are not mandatory. So this is not a forced question. So folks could bypass this question altogether. They could click prefer not to say, or they could make multiple selections from the list. So because we added this question, it was our question, InSync did not do the data analysis in the report that they sent back to us. So we had to do that analysis ourselves. And we only very recently began doing this, and it was related to another assessment project that I've been working on concerning Indigenous students. So we started digging into this data to see what we could find out in particular with this question regarding Indigenous students. So keep in mind that this data is very fresh. I think just 2 weeks ago, we were looking at this data. So it hasn't been discussed internally at Dal Libraries yet. So we can't stand here and we can't talk about what we're going to do with this data necessarily. So just bear with us when it comes to that. But we thought that we could at least show you what the results were for some of these questions. We wanted to take advantage of this opportunity today. We thought it'd be a good idea for sharing. So just a quick note, when I said that InSync did not do the data analysis, that is often typical with these prepackaged surveys, that you have to do data analysis of your own to look at specific respondent groups. That is often quite easily done within Excel, simple Excel functions. But when it came to this question, we really felt it was super important and we wanted to be very, very careful with what we gleaned from the data. So we decided to go the extra mile and do some statistical significance testing. And Lachlan is going to take over and talk about that.
Yeah, so basically we could spend an hour on the methods that we did, but I'm going to give you the very short version. Just like, you don't even have to retain it. Just, I feel like I am obligated to tell you what we did. But we did kind of a descriptive analysis. We looked at means, things like that. We pulled apart the variables. So because people could respond to multiple selections, to actually analyze the stuff, we had to pull it apart and kind of make them into their own variables that were yes/no variables, basically. So a single individual could be represented in a series of yes/nos, like a binary code on the old like punch card computers. And then based on those means tests, we were noticing that some of the results were getting washed out. We couldn't really tell how much our bias was guiding things and what was true and what was not. So we applied two kind of statistical tests. The first is Fisher's exact test, which is a test of the significance of the association. So just seeing how well our sample and the groups that we were analyzing, how well that represents the greater population. So if I take 5 people from this room, how representative are those 5 people of the population of the room, for instance? And then the other thing I did was Goodman and Kirkshaw's gamma strength and direction association. So this tells us like, okay, yes, we know there's a relationship, but how strong is the relationship? Like, yes, maybe there's a relationship between like me going to work and drinking coffee, but like, is it unique to me? You know, things like that. How strong is that actual relationship? Am I drinking 18 cups of coffee every day? Stuff like that. So, ended up with this giant table, which I'm not going to explain, but is just show you like how much detail we went into everything. We have our various association tests here, color coded by strength. So yellow stronger. A good example of the strongest one up here is distance students and how often you come to the library. So like, what do you think? Like distance students not coming to the library very often, right? That's why the association is so strong. So that's a good kind of like benchmark of like, okay, the test is working as intended. For this presentation, we narrowed this block of questions down to things that we thought were a bit more applicable and also were interesting and had kind of high significance scores across the board. And then I'll go through these one by one as well, because it's still unreadable mess. So first one, library signage is clear. So this question, this table here, I have the means here, mean responses. The stars represent statistical significance, and then the color is the strength of the relationship. So yellow is stronger than green. Green means like they're associated, but it's like there's not much going on. So in this case, first gen international students both believe that library signage being clear was important to them. And that was unique to them from, say, non-international students and non-first gen students. And then as a comparison here, you can see the none of above category. The mean is quite a bit lower. So the none of above category, we're always seeing like a strong association and strong significance, but it's negative. So the gamma score can have a negative score, which means that if you are none of the above, you found it less likely to be important. You found it less important. So the question, and this was true of every question. So the none of above category, they were always finding these questions were not as important to them. So online help services meet my needs. So first gen students, this was important to them. International students, this was important to them. This is another common pattern. International students, a lot of the services, they placed high importance, higher than other groups on it. So they have a mean of a 5.75 answer. And then none of above, they're scoring a bit lower. So it's less important to people who do not identify with any of these categories or the other ones we measured. So people, you know, just, they don't identify with any of those categories. Face-to-face help from library staff meets my needs. So for this, we saw it was important to Black students, first-gen students, international students, and was less important for none of the above. So these three students groups really felt that face-to-face help was an important service for them. Library staff provides accurate answers to my inquiries. So LGBTQ2SIA+ students were finding this was more important than none above. This is a good example where the mean, see how close the mean is? If you just looked at means here, you'd be like, this is virtually identical. But when you pull it apart and you look at, like, say, a table of all the responses, then that's where we're getting like this kind of color coding and the strength of association, because there is quite a strong relationship between the QD respondents and this question. But when you get a mean, it's basically pulling everything into like a mathematical, just kind of like blob, and you're losing some of the detail about what they find is important. I feel comfortable asking for help in the library. So this was important to Black students, Indigenous students, international students, less important to none above. These other groups, you know, we have their mean scores, but the relationship, it wasn't unique to them. So like when you compare first gen students to non-first gen students, first gen wasn't unique from non-first gen in terms of how important they found it. Like they were homogenous versus like Black students versus non-Black students. Like Black students had a much higher importance rating than non-Black students on this question. So, the library website provides useful information. So Black students compared to non-Black students, first gen compared to non-first gen, international compared to non-international, and QT plus students, they all found that this was much more important for them. And then none of above, we're seeing a lower score here. So this kind of presents kind of just a representation of the flip side of all of these numbers. I find it easy to use mobile devices to access online library resources. So international students, again, they just love everything. Everything's important to them. Like when we go back to the main table, it's like yellow all the way down. Like they love it. So they love the library, they love everything. So it was good. And also a lot of respondents. So when you look at the number of people responding, it's very easy to work with the data because a lot of people were responding. So QT plus important. And then interesting for this question and why we included is students with a disability who normally didn't have a statistically significant relationship with a lot of the questions. In this case, this was one that was important to them. Ease of use on mobile devices for library resources, which we know based on other data we have and qualitative data and theory and stuff that this is something that would be of importance. So the data is reflecting things we already know, but it's strengthening it because we're getting, rather than 5 respondents, we're getting like 250 respondents. Library workshops, classes, and tutorials help me with my learning and research needs. So first-gen students, important to them, but the relationship is fairly weak. International students, like super strong again, just like very important. And then none of them are above, quite a big difference in the mean. Like they really just are not super interested in the library workshops, classes, and tutorials. Not sure why this is. This is one when we were going through it, we're like, why? And that's something we'll need to like look at this data, but then also the other data that Linda has to figure out why, like what are the workshops? Well, who's coming to them? Things like that. So back to Linda.
Okay, so this table just summarizes everything that Lachlan said, just in one slide. So these are, all of the survey statements that we looked at for today, and then the student groups that placed a particularly high importance on them. So for library signage being clear, we have our international students, first generation students. Online help meets my needs, particularly important to international students, first generation and distance students. And as you can see, as Lachlan mentioned, international is showing up for just about everything here. Face-to-face help meets my needs, international, first gen and Black students. Staff provide accurate answers. Just one group there, LGBTQ2SIA plus, those folks. I feel comfortable asking for help, international students, Black and Indigenous students. Website providing useful information, international students, first generation Black, LGBTQ2SIA+. Mobile devices, being easy to access resources with, international, LGBTQ2SIA+, students with a disability. And workshops, classes, and tutorials, particularly important, again, to international students and first generation. So that, did you have a question? Yeah, sure.
Is that in order of which the strongest answers were found, the library?
No, it's not in, yeah, and do I need to repeat that question for the folks at home? Yes, so somebody here in person just asked if the questions are placed in order of the strongest importance. No, because we're looking at several different groups at once. I think they're actually in order of being asked in the survey. Pretty sure they are actually, yeah. So going forward from here, obviously we have to discuss the results internally, and Lachlan and I aren't quite ready for that because we still have more number crunching to do because there are a lot more questions from the survey than what we just highlighted today. We would then have to decide on, I think in most cases, further study before we start acting on service changes, but there may be some things that we're ready to just simply improve upon. But I think further study, particularly to find out what exactly is it about, library signage or workshops, classes that are important, particularly to international students, for example. And then if we do make any changes, of course, it's the cycle of assessment. You have to follow up with further assessment. So that leads us to the end where we can take questions or any comments, anything that you might find particularly interesting. I just want to highlight here, the reason why we chose these particular questions to share today is because they fall within a few themes. So we have our, at the top there, so we have our wayfinding with the library signage question. We have help finding with those 4 questions there. And then those bottom 3 are kind of the things that folks are doing to get started with doing library research. So altogether, these are kind of the initial interactions with the library. And so if we're seeing that they are particularly important to these particular groups of students, then we also have to place an importance on these services as well. So I guess we'll just open up for questions now or comments.
Any questions in the room? I've already asked online, so if anybody's percolating online, they are doing it. Just one sec, Suzanne.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering what your response rate was.
So we don't actually calculate response rate with these types of surveys because they're not simple email invitations. Like we post posters, we have pop-up invitations on our Learning Commons computers, we had invitations within our learning management system. So you can't really do a response rate, but I can say I have it here. Just give me a second.
So I have a follow-up question.
For students in particular, so just students alone, we had 5,702 students. So that is pretty good out of roughly 20,000, a little over 20,000 students.
So in addition to self-identifying for these underrepresented groups, you then also asked for people to identify as undergraduate, graduate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of standard with those prepackaged surveys.
Thank you.
And that, like, you start with the 5,000, but then as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, you get down to like very small groups. And the tests that we had to use were specific to having to deal with some of the groups getting really small per question, per group, per this. It like gets eventually pretty small. Yeah.
Melissa.
I assume because there's more number crunching to happen and those numbers will keep getting smaller, like in terms of, is the library signage clear? Like, is that people saying that, is it like because they're more affiliated with the Killam versus the Kellogg versus Sexton? Will you be able to get down to those numbers?
Yes, and we have already. So there were some preliminary reports that went out to the heads of the libraries for just the space-related questions, of which the signage would have been included in that. Yeah.
And also, like, we started just goofing, like not goofing around, but testing. That's the wrong word. But I started like testing like what you would call multivariate model. So you're looking at like what's the effect of your library versus your identity. Like what has a stronger effect on the score and stuff like that. But again, as we get really small into the groups, it's hard to do that because it just gets too small. So it may be that this is as far as we can go because you just won't meet the requirements for the tests.
I have a question about the numbers we were looking at. There was a number, and it was usually something like 5 point something or 6 point something, and then there was the two different categories that we knew about the numbers, right? Was the number a mean?
Yeah, so
The number is the mean of the 0 to 7 or whatever, and then the two treatments are the weak, moderate, strong association, and then whether or not it's statistically significant. Is that right?
yes.
So maybe this is quibbly, but I don't think it is. Sometimes you're saying it wasn't important to the group, but it might have been that the none of the above was 6 out of 7. So I wouldn't think it was not important, but it's disproportionately slightly less important than it was to other groups. That's really not the same as not important to that group, right? Am I missing something about the tests?
So one less important, and one of the things I mentioned is, so this is one of the risks. So we balance like, do we show the gamma score or the mean?
Mm-hmm.
So the mean kind of washes out and shows a bunch of 5s and 6s and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the other scores, you end up looking at the power of the relationship and how much lower they were.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of outliers with it that end up pulling the mean, making it kind of flat. So the mean, like, it's easy to digest because you can just see like this is higher than this, right? But really what is being represented in terms of what we were looking at is like the gamma score,
Okay.
and the stuff there. And the mean was just a way to sort of like people understand the mean will show.
Okay, but I actually misunderstood it from the mean because it's like if you're using the mean as information, it doesn't help you in that way.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was one of the issues we had with the results that came out of the survey, was they did everything based on means and difference in means. And so we wanted to start doing other types of tests because it was getting washed out by just having means. And also they weren't doing significance testing. So sometimes things would have like seemingly like a very high important score or something, but like one person was asked, like it wasn't actually like significant, or there weren't a number of people responding to it, or it had a very large standard deviation. So you're looking at like a huge range of responses.
Any other questions in the room or online? I'm not seeing anybody posting anything in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and talk verbally. We'd love to hear other voices. So we're good. Thank you very much, Linda and Lachlan. This has been fantastic. It's nice to see that there is this stuff we can do beyond just the regular, I guess, like surveys and things that we do, that we can actually customize some of these things and that we can actually go beyond the data and get other data. But thank you.